In palaces built for dreams, it's the whispers that last longer than the music. It began not with love, but with an empire's expectation. In 1881, the Habsburg Empire was dying in slow motion. Austria's crown, Prince Rudolf, heir to Emperor Franz Joseph and Empress Elizabeth, was the man born to save it. And yet, even as his birthright gleamed in gold, the young prince's soul was already splintering. Beneath the weight of centuries, Vienna's palaces glowed with chandeliers, but inside, there was only silence, formality, and fear. The emperor ruled with cold precision. The empress fled her gilded cage in endless travel, and their son, Rudolf, grew up desperate for affection, drowning in tutors, religion, and rules. By the time he turned 22, the empire demanded he marry. Not for love, not for joy, for survival. That's when Princess Stephanie of Belgium entered the story. A bright, tall, shy girl of 16, daughter of King Leopold II, her father, known even then as the Builder King, and later, the Butcher of the Congo, saw his daughter not as a girl, but as a piece in a dynastic game. He offered her to Vienna like a gift of diplomacy. Gilded and silent. Stephanie, young and obedient, dreamed of romance. Rudolf, already weary and disillusioned, saw her as duty. When their engagement was announced, Vienna rejoiced. Newspapers declared it a union of youth and promise. Bells rang across the empire, but behind the palace doors, the shadows were gathering. Rudolf had already begun his dangerous descent. Cigarettes, morphine, and whispered affairs with courtesans. He detested the rigid military life his father forced upon him, preferring books, science, and liberal ideals. He read Darwin, wrote against clericalism, and questioned everything the empire stood for. To his father, he was a disappointment to the church, a danger to himself, perhaps already lost. Their marriage took place in Vienna on May 10, 1881, a glittering ceremony in St. Augustine's Church, all gold and glory. The empress wore black, as she always did, mourning her own lost son, and in that sea of lace and jewels, Princess Stephanie stood trembling, a child wrapped in white satin, her face pale as snow. Rudolf smiled only for the cameras. That night, as fireworks lit the skies over Vienna, witnesses said the groom disappeared from the celebration. He returned later, silent and cold, in Stephanie's diary. She would later write a single chilling line: "I was a wife, and I was already alone." The marriage of shadows. At first, Stephanie tried. She adored her husband, saw in him the promise of intellect and reform. He spoke of modern ideas, democracy, science, the end of superstition. He loathed the military parades, the stifling rituals of his father's court, and for a brief moment, she believed she could save him. But love cannot thrive where ghosts linger. Within a year, Rudolf's affection had vanished. He found her too young, too naive, too Belgian for Vienna's taste. He mocked her manners, withdrew his warmth, and soon turned to mistresses once more. Vienna's court whispered. The empress pitied her. The emperor ignored her. Stephanie's only friend was her newborn daughter, Elizabeth, named after the empress herself, though the gift did nothing to soften her husband's disdain. After the birth, tragedy struck. A careless medical procedure left Stephanie unable to bear more children. Rudolf's disappointment turned to cruelty. He told friends, "The line of succession ends with me." He began to drink heavily, disappear for days, and return smelling of perfume and opium. He brought courtesans into his circle, among them Baroness Mary Wetzera, the name that would later eclipse Stephanie's forever. The palace became a stage of polite hatred. Every dinner, every ball, every photograph a masquerade of smiles concealing decay. Rudolf and Stephanie stood side by side, but their eyes never met. In letters to his mother, Rudolf wrote of a wife made of marble. In her journal, Stephanie described a husband consumed by darkness, the rebel prince by the mid-1880s. Crown Prince Rudolf was more than a man at war with his marriage. He was a man at war with his empire. He hated his father's alliance with Germany, despised Bismarck, and dreamed of a liberal Austria that would embrace reform. He met secretly with journalists, wrote under pseudonyms, and encouraged anti-imperial discussions. He spoke of a modern Europe, one that frightened the old emperor deeply. The police spied on him. His friends were interrogated, his letters censored. He was trapped, surrounded, and watched the gilded cage tightening with every breath. Stephanie tried to be the perfect empress, appearing at charity events, dressing modestly, playing her part, but behind her polite smile, she began to crumble. The marriage was dead. In the court, merciless. Rumors spread of Rudolf's affairs. One in particular, a striking actress named Missy Casper, became notorious. It was said Rudolf gave her a pistol, telling her, "When you wish to end your suffering, use this." It was not Missy who used it, but the gesture foreshadowed what was to come. Stephanie and Rudolf lived separate lives under the same roof. She dined alone. He disappeared into hunting lodges, libraries, and secret chambers. Their words turned into silence. Their silence turned into hate, and then into something far worse. The invitation to Mayerling B. Late 1888. Rudolf's health had deteriorated. Migraines, insomnia, and trembling hands. Doctors warned of exhaustion, but those closest to him whispered of despair. He was said to speak often of death and of escape. It was during this time that he met Baroness Mary Vetz, a 17-year-old noblewoman. She was young, romantic, and fatally devoted. Rudolf called her his angel of deliverance to Mary. He was a tragic hero, the misunderstood prince trapped in a cruel empire. They exchanged passionate letters, pledging eternal love in life or in death. When Stephanie found out, she said nothing. She had learned long ago that confrontation meant humiliation. But others noticed that the empress was alarmed, the emperor furious, and yet no one could stop the slow drift toward disaster. In January 1889, Rudolf told his hunting companions he wished to spend a few days at his country lodge in Mayerling, near Vienna. It was a quiet, secluded estate, the perfect place for reflection, or so it seemed. On January 28th, he arrived there with servants and guards. 2 days later, Mary Vetzera joined him, secretly, dressed in disguise. For 3 days, the lodge was silent. On the night of January 29th, villagers reported hearing music, laughter, then sudden stillness. At dawn, on January 30th, 1889, Mayerling awoke to horror. A valet, knocking on the prince's door, received no answer. When he finally forced it open, the sight froze him to the floor. Inside, Crown Prince Rudolf lay dead. At his side, the lifeless body of Mary Vetzera. A pistol lay between them. The empire's future extinguished in a single night. The news was suppressed once officials rushed to Mayerling. The emperor's messengers arrived before dawn. Doctors, priests, and soldiers filled the small lodge, sealing every window, burning letters, erasing evidence. The world would be told it was an accident, then a murder-suicide, then a mystery. For Stephanie, the truth would come not from a messenger, but from silence. Her husband was dead. Her marriage, her rank, her future, gone with him. She was 24 years old. He died with another woman's name on his lips, and the empire buried them both in lies. The Mayerling tragedy would become one of Europe's greatest royal scandals, a story of love, death, and betrayal that shook the foundations of empires. But for Stephanie of Belgium, the forgotten wife, it was only the beginning of her descent, the beginning of her pain. The dead do not vanish, they echo through the corridors of those who survive them. The morning after death, Vienna awoke that winter morning to an unnatural silence. The snow fell soft and heavy, covering the city like a burial shroud. But inside Hofburg Palace, there was chaos at dawn. Messengers arrived from Merling. Their faces were pale, their words trembling. The emperor was still in bed when the knock came. 3 sharp raps that shattered the imperial stillness. When Franz Joseph opened the sealed letter, his hands began to shake. His only son, dead by his own hand, with a woman not his wife. He did not weep, he merely whispered, "The succession is finished." The news was too terrible for the world to hear unfiltered. Austria was a Catholic empire. Suicide was a mortal sin. A crown prince dying in such disgrace could not be buried in sanctified ground. The monarchy itself might have fallen, so the cover-up began. Doctors were summoned, not to save a life, but to invent a story. They declared Rudolf's death the result of an apoplectic stroke. A lie so clumsy, it collapsed within hours. When courtiers whispered of a gunshot wound, the story changed again. A tragic accident while cleaning his weapon, and when that too failed, the church intervened. Under immense pressure, the Vatican granted permission for Rudolf to be buried as a Catholic, on the grounds that he had acted in a state of mental imbalance. That phrase saved the Habsburg dynasty, but it destroyed what remained of truth. The widow, in Shadow's princess, Stephanie heard of her husband's death, not from the emperor, nor from her mother-in-law, but from a trembling chambermaid. She was sitting at her writing desk when the girl entered, pale as marble. "Your Imperial Highness," she whispered. "His Royal Highness is gone." Stephanie rose slowly, as though waking from a dream. Gone where? There was no answer, only silence, the kind that tells everything without words. Later that day, she was summoned before the emperor. Franz Joseph stood at the window, his back to her, staring into the snow. He spoke without turning. "You will remain silent. There will be no questions. You are the widow of the crown prince. You will behave as such. No comfort, no explanation. Only command." Rudolf's body was returned to Vienna under heavy guard. The coffin sealed before anyone could look inside. Stephanie was forbidden to see him one last time. When she begged, the emperor's aide replied simply, "It is better that you remember him as he was." But how was he? The man she loved, the man who scorned her, the father of her child, or the stranger who died in another woman's arms? Even Stephanie could no longer tell. The funeral of silence on February 5th, 1889. Vienna stood still. The streets were black with mourning banners. Bells tolled across the city as soldiers lined the route from the Hofburg to the Capuchin crypt. The imperial tomb, the coffin, draped in the Habsburg flag, moved slowly through the streets. Crowds wept openly. Some fainted, others whispered curses under their breath, blaming the emperor, blaming the church, blaming fate itself. Behind the procession walked the empress, veiled in black lace. Beside her, Princess Stephanie, pale, rigid, her eyes vacant. Every step echoed like a heartbeat that refused to stop. When the coffin was lowered into the crypt, a single candle flickered and died. Witnesses later said the empress turned her head away, unable to look. Stephanie stood still, lips barely moving, whispering the words, "He has escaped, and I remain." The erased woman after the funeral. The empire moved swiftly to erase the scandal. Mary Wetzera's body was smuggled out of Merling before dawn, buried in secrecy at Heiligenkreuz Abbey. Her name was forbidden in polite conversation. Her letters burned. Her memory, officially non-existent, Mayerling, itself was converted by imperial decree into a Carmelite convent. The room where the lovers died became a chapel. The bed was replaced by an altar. Rudolf's death was declared an act of divine mystery, and the empire resumed its rigid march toward the 20th century, cold, unbending, unchanged. And Stephanie, she was left with nothing. Her title meant little without a husband. Her position at court vanished overnight. Her father-in-law treated her like a living embarrassment. Her daughter, now the emperor's ward, was taken from her care in the halls of Vienna. People called her the widow of sin, once destined to be Empress of Austria. Stephanie became an exile in her own palace. A father's cruelty desperate for refuge, Stephanie wrote to her father, King Leopold II of Belgium. She pleaded to return home, to be near her family. The king's reply was as cold as the marble floors she walked upon. You have shamed us enough. Remain where you are. Leopold, obsessed with his colonial empire and public image, saw her not as a grieving daughter, but as a liability. Her failure as a wife and Rudolph's scandal had stained the royal family's name. She was forbidden to attend family functions. Her allowance was cut. She was, once again, alone. But Stephanie did not break. Not yet. She began to write diaries, memoirs, letters, private words that would one day become the only voice left from the wreckage. In them, she revealed a bitter truth. They mourned him as a martyr, but they buried me alive. The years of exile. Stephanie left Vienna soon after, taking refuge in Switzerland. There, she began to reinvent herself, not as a princess, but as a woman who had survived history's cruelty. In 1900, to the shock of every royal house in Europe, she married again, Count Elomer Lunja, a Hungarian nobleman with no fortune and no crown. The newspapers mocked her. The imperial family disowned her completely. She was stripped of her titles, her rank, her dignity. From her imperial and royal highness to simply Countess Lanier, a fall so steep it became legend. But for the first time, she was free. The marriage, though modest, brought her a strange peace. They lived quietly in a small estate in Orashvar, now Rus of Slovakia. She tended to her garden, read endlessly, and received almost no visitors. The woman who had once been destined for a throne now cooked her own meals and walked the village paths, alone. Yet the ghosts of Merling never left. Her dots, she saw them in the snow, in the wind, in the faint echo of church bells at dawn. The truth surfaces. Decades passed, and the world changed. Empires fell, kings were exiled, wars tore Europe apart. In 1914, when the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Rudolph's nephew, plunged the world into the First World War, Stephanie watched from her estate, silent and grim. The empire that had crushed her was finally dying. By 1918, Austria-Hungary was gone. The Habsburgs fled, their palaces emptied, and in the ruins of that fallen world, Stephanie began to write her memoirs, a work so bitter and unflinching that it shocked what remained of polite society. She called it, "I Should Have Been Empress." In it, she spoke of Rudolph's cruelty, his madness, his affairs, and his obsession with death. But she also revealed her own suffering, the humiliation, the loneliness, the betrayal. It was not a royal memoir, it was a confession. The book was banned in Austria. The Vatican condemned it, but readers devoured it, eager to glimpse the truth behind the silks and diamonds. Through her words, Stephanie finally avenged herself against the empire that had silenced her. The forgotten ending. Countess Lanier, once Princess Stephanie of Belgium, once crowned Princess of Austria, died in 1945. Her death was as quiet as her life had become. She was found in her small study, seated beside a window, a book open in her lap. Outside, Soviet soldiers were entering the village. The war was ending. Europe was burning. No grand funeral, no marble crypt, just a simple grave beside her husband. Her daughter, Archduchess Elizabeth, never forgave her mother. Their relationship remained distant until the end. Another wound that history never healed, the legacy of Merling to this day. No one truly knows what happened at May, IERLING. Was it a suicide pact, a murder, a political assassination, disguised as tragedy? Some historians believe Rudolph was murdered for his liberal views. Others claim he and Mary, Vetsera, made a romantic suicide pact, sealed by despair. Still, others whisper that the emperor himself ordered the cover-up to protect the dynasty. The truth lies buried in that small lodge in the Vienna woods, now silent, except for the prayers of the nuns who live there. Visitors say the air inside still feels heavy, as if the walls remember. Epilogue: the blood-stained veil. History does not weep for the forgotten. It feeds on them. Princess Stephanie's story is not one of love, but of survival. She was not a villain, nor a saint, just a woman born into the machinery of power, used, discarded, and finally erased. Rudolph died seeking freedom. Mary died for love. Stephanie lived, and in some ways, that was the cruelest fate of all. Her life stands as a reminder that behind every royal scandal, there is a human heart, broken, silenced, and still beating in the shadows of history. The blood-stained veil, a story of love that became duty, duty that became betrayal, and betrayal that ended in death. And when the empire buried its prince, it buried his wife's soul with him.